first thing she noticed was the sound. Not loud, not sharp, just a soft trembling rustle inside the house, like a page turning on its own. Elaine stood in the doorway of her late mother's study, still holding her breath, still unsure why she'd come in here after avoiding the room for nearly a year. A thin stripe of morning light cut across the carpet, brushing against an old paper box she hadn't seen in decades. The lid was slightly open, as if something inside had been waiting. She didn't touch it at first, she only watched. Because some boxes don't just hold objects, some hold pressure, memory, expectations you once promised you'd meet. And on that quiet Thursday, with the house still smelling faintly of cedar and winter air, Elaine felt something stir, an old ache, familiar but distant, like a voice she used to answer without thinking. She stepped in slowly. Her hands grazed the edge of the desk, steadying herself, as if the room carried gravity she wasn't prepared to face. The box was simple, brown, worn, the corners soft from years of moving through different closets. It wasn't locked, it wasn't labeled, it wasn't meant to be dramatic. But the moment she lifted the lid, the emotional temperature in the room changed just enough for her chest to tighten. Inside were papers from a life she'd lived before. She learned how to hide disappointment with efficiency, all checking book carbon copies, printed statements, clipped receipts from a grocery store that no longer existed, a folded envelope with her handwriting from when she was 21. A whole record of the years she spent trying to prove she was responsible enough, by someone else's definition. She sank into her mother's old desk chair, surprised at how cold the leather felt through her sweater. Her fingers hovered above the papers, not ready to touch them yet. The house around her was quiet, almost protective, as if giving her space to move at her own rhythm. She reached for one envelope, the one with her young handwriting, looped, hopeful, stretching too high in places, like she'd once reached for things she thought would bring her stability and security. Inside was a single receipt, just a grocery receipt, a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, dish soap, and then at the bottom, in ink so faded it looked nearly washed out. Balance after purchase, $14.02. Elaine felt her throat tighten. She remembered that day. She remembered the way she'd stood at the checkout line, quietly calculating how long she had until the next small paycheck. She remembered the flicker of fear she carried like a shadow, the fear of being seen as someone who wasn't on track. She remembered the weight, the responsibility, the pressure, the unspoken expectations. She pressed her thumb against the thin paper, as if she could feel the pulse of the younger version of herself, the woman who spent years trying to outrun the echo of scarcity, even when her life later looked stable from the outside. A soft gust of wind pressed against the house. Somewhere, a vent rattled, but nothing pulled her out of the moment. She placed the receipt down and picked up the next item. It was a folded letter, one she'd written to her mother and never sent. The edges were sharp, as if she'd creased it with more force than she meant to. Inside, the words were raw. She had written about frustration, about feeling lost in her identity, about wanting freedom but not knowing what it should look like. She had written about money but not the numbers, about the deeper thing beneath it, the longing for peace, for clarity, for alignment she didn't yet have a name for. She closed the letter gently, letting her fingers rest on top of it. Her mother had kept it anyway, unsent, unread, but kept. Elaine leaned back in the chair, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, subtle, quiet, unhurried. The kind of day that doesn't ask anything of you. She wondered how long she'd been living in a rhythm that never matched the truth of who she was becoming. So much of her life had been built around being the reliable one, the strong one, the one who always knew the responsible choice. She wore the role like a uniform, clean, pressed, predictable. But the box in front of her was a different kind of archive, not of mistakes, but of the moments that shaped the quiet architecture of her fear. She reached for the last envelope, not old, not yellowed, just untouched. Inside was a simple bank notification, printed only a month before her mother passed. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, but handwritten at the bottom in ink that still looked fresh. "You're doing better than you think." Her breath broke, not a sob, not a gasp, just a soft, fragile exhale, like something inside her had loosened for the first time in years. She placed the paper over her heart without meaning to. For a full minute, she didn't move. Her mother had never been a woman of big speeches. She didn't give advice. She lived quietly, believing people eventually found their own clarity if you just let them breathe long enough. And somehow, even in her absence, she had offered the only thing Elaine had never known how to offer herself: gentleness. Elaine rose from the chair, her legs a little unsteady, not from sadness but from the strange, subtle lightness that settles in when a truth finally stops waiting to be acknowledged. She carried the 3 items, the grocery receipt, the unsent letter, the new bank notice, to the kitchen. She placed them beside her mug, still half full of lukewarm tea. The steam was gone, but the moment hadn't cooled. She sat at the table and let the silence hold her. Her life wasn't chaotic, she wasn't struggling, but somewhere along the way her sense of purpose had been padded in layers of noise, tasks, obligations, stories she'd inherited without question. This box, this morning, this unexpected clarity, it wasn't about money, not really. It was about identity, about the quiet kind of awakening that begins when you finally turn toward the parts of your life you'd been too busy or too cautious to look at directly. She picked up the grocery receipt again, letting her thumb follow the printed lines. A younger her had once lived with only $14 left in her account, and she had survived. She had built a life with more stability, more security, more breathing room than she once believed was possible, but the ache she felt wasn't about scarcity. It was about the quiet burden of never updating the internal script that had formed back then, the script that said she always had to hold everything together, even when nothing was falling apart. The morning light shifted on the table, warming the wood. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to listen inward. She didn't need answers. She didn't need a plan. All she needed was to sit still long enough to feel the difference between the life she'd been carrying and the life that was quietly asking to emerge. She opened her eyes again and looked at the 3 items on the table. They no longer felt heavy. They felt honest. A record not of what she lacked, but of what she had outgrown. She reached for her tea, took a slow sip, and let the warmth settle in her chest. Something in her had shifted. Quietly, gently, almost imperceptibly, but it had shifted. She gathered the 3 items and placed them in a fresh folder, white, clean, unburdened by the past. She didn't hide them. She didn't tuck the folder away. She set it on the counter where she could see it every morning if she wanted to, not as a reminder of pressure, but as a soft, steady anchor of where she'd been and how deeply she'd changed without noticing. Elaine stood there for a moment, letting one hand rest on the folder, grounding herself in the silence. She didn't know exactly what the next chapter of her inner life would look like, but she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: space. Not the kind created by empty rooms or long weekends, but the kind that opens up inside you when the emotional weight you've carried for years finally sets itself down. She took a slow breath, letting it travel all the way to the bottom of her lungs. The house felt different now, not lighter, not heavier, just more honest. As she walked toward the living room, the morning light followed her, soft, understated, like an old friend who didn't need to speak to be understood. And life moved with her, quietly shifting, gently expanding, preparing her for something she couldn't name yet. And what came after this wasn't louder, just deeper, the kind of truth that finds you when you're finally ready.